Welcome everyone. Thank you for attending the non-clinical side of the coin discussion today. We will highlight what has radically changed and what has stayed the same. Before we start, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Sue DiMarino. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at IHS. Prior to joining IHS, I worked at URAC for 17 years. Next, I'd like to introduce Tom Goddard, who is our CEO and owner of IHS. Tom, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Hello from wherever you are. It's a pleasure to have you here today. I hope you all are safe and sound. Again, my name's Tom Goddard. I am the CEO of Integral Healthcare Solutions, which I founded a little over 18 years ago. Before that, I was the Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel for URAC. For that, I was also involved in accreditation in my capacity as Vice President and General Counsel of a large Mid-Atlantic health plan. I've been in the accreditation world for about 25 years. By training, I'm a lawyer and an industrial organizational psychologist. And I'll toss it back to you, Sue.
Sure. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Leslie Malice Reed, the president of IHS. Leslie?
Hi, thanks, Sue. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about the other side of the coin, the non-clinical aspects of the specialty pharmacy and mail service pharmacy standards. I started in the Canadian healthcare system and worked at one of the larger Mid-Atlantic health plans. And then I went to URAC in 1997, helped write some of the programs and was a reviewer there for several years. But then I really thought it'd be more fun getting applicants ready for accreditation. So since 2003, I have been doing that aspect. Sue, back to you.
Sure. Leslie will be covering standards in 3 focused areas today: patient service and communication, consumer protection and empowerment, and operations and infrastructure. And Leslie?
Thanks. Let's bring up that slideshow, if you wouldn't mind, Sue. I'm going to start with the first focus area that Sue mentioned, the patient service and communication services, also known as PSC. This is the old CSCD standards for those of you who have gone through accreditation. And really, they have shortened a lot of the standards. There was a lot of redundancy in, for example, CSCD 1 that had 21 elements, and it was very similar to CSCD 7 and 11. The theme is the same. Upon enrollment, a prescriber is going to get a certain amount of information sent to them via welcome packet. And then continuing communication will also continue and address some of these inquiry-worthy topics. So your staff needs to be trained. You have to have a policy and procedure on these topics, and it's so that they can answer questions about access to your organization. Some of the other themes include filling prescriptions, order status, prescription transfer, safe drug disposal, financial information such as copays. So that is really the PSC 1 and 2 standards, those types of communication. And then they jump into other standards such as PSC 1-4, accommodating diverse populations. That would be the old CSCD 12 standards. Nothing's really changed there. They've broken it down into more categories, but the themes are the same. Making accommodations for language lines, for linguistic differences, cultural differences, making sure you're going to train your staff. Really, nothing has changed here. Cognitive impairments and physical impairments. So that's all the same. Moving on to our second thank you slide. This standard actually has changed. This is PSC 2-1 and 2-2. Now, the theme of this was, the theme of this used to be for the patient and the client under satisfaction. Notice now that the theme has now changed to be able to survey patients and prescribers under satisfaction, and complaints that used to be really just addressing consumers are now consumers and prescribers. I want to just spend a little bit of time on this first element here, PSC 2-1A, measure patient and prescriber complaints data. This is related to another one of their standards under another focus area called consumer empowerment. It's CPE 4-1. And that goes through the old Core 34 standards that talks about all of the complaints. You must be able to receive and resolve complaints within a specific time frame. You're going to be able to describe how you communicate the resolution, and finally making sure that you are monitoring different categories of complaints. So for example, not who the complaints came from, that's not a category, but the category could be something like cold chain or access. And then you would submit that to your quality committee. Under the patient and prescriber satisfaction, same thing. They want to make sure that you're going to describe your process for how you're measuring satisfaction, that you are in a periodic time frame, quarterly, annually, going to present that information to your quality committee. So the only change really is that there's no more client satisfaction, and that the consumer and the prescriber are now included in the scope of complaints and satisfaction collection. Now I'm going to jump back into our patient service communication focus area and talk about PSC 3-1. That's our telephone performance access standards. There are now no more blockage rates required. So our access standards used to have to do with making sure that we addressed average speed of answer, the abandonment rate, and then also making sure that we address blockage rate. So as I said, blockage rate is gone, but we still need to be able to collect information on those two other categories and submit them to your quality committee. PSC 3-2 has to do with making sure that we have a policy and procedure that describes our non-telephonic communication. So for example, if you're getting inquiries via email, what's the turnaround time for addressing that? That is up to you to decide, but make sure you have a reporting mechanism. That used to be your old CSCD 7A and 11A and 10. That is now wrapped up into Element A. They have also added a new leading indicator. If you remember URAC scoring, leading indicators have no weights. So they're testing the standard in the market. It could become something in the future, but should your organization decide not to meet this leading indicator, that's fine. You don't have to jump through hoops to try and make this happen. The theme of this new leading indicator has to do with bidirectional electronic communication. That does not include telephonic communications, fax, or IVRs. It's something such as web-based. So bidirectional communication, electronic communication. Okay. There seems to be a question about telephone performance.
Let me see if I can pull that up for
Okay.
you.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was actually just Kristen. Just so you know, under the chat section of this Zoom call, you can find that we are writing notes about some of the themes that we're talking about today as well, for you to follow along. Okay. So I'm going to now move into my second focus area, consumer protection, CPE. CPE 3-1, the clinical staff credentialing. There's really not that many changes in this area, but where there used to be leading indicator of having to primary source verify the licensure for clinical staff who are hired, such as your pharmacists, upon expiration, that has now gone away. So you are required to complete primary source verification of any clinical license or certification upon hire. And that's really prior to their start date. They cannot assume any of their clinical duties prior to having this verification. So we encourage you to do this prior to the start date and then within every 3 years. So a best practice might be upon expiration, but you no longer have to do that. Let's go on to the next slide, please. CPE 3-2. This has to do with making sure that you have one senior management representative who can address all of these responsibilities and have these qualifications. there is a change in the qualification. They used to require that your most senior clinical person had a current and unrestricted license. And now the change is that they have to have a license to practice in a relevant jurisdiction. Some states require by law that they have it in their state. Some of the reviewers were requiring us to state in the job descriptions or have us recommend that you state in your job descriptions that it would be within the state of Texas, for example. Now it's clearly stated in the standard that they want you to identify what jurisdiction they need to have their license in. All of the other aspects of this standard, which has combined the old core 31 and 32, are pretty much the same. They have to have certain qualifications as defined by you to have clinical oversight. They must have responsibility for oversight of clinical decision-making aspects of the program. And I'd like to spend a minute of time on element D. Ensures that qualified clinicians are accountable to the organization for decisions affecting consumers. That is a new standard. In the old section, it used to be that this individual had to ensure they were hiring qualified staff. Really, it's somewhat similar. It's in the same theme. And so making sure that you have your qualified clinical staff can be, for example, ensuring that the senior person is involved in developing the job descriptions for clinical staff, making sure there's an education program that they're overseeing for these clinical staff. They're involved in evaluations. These are all examples of how to talk about how your clinical person can meet this standard. Okay. The next section of this area, the CPE 3-2, 3-3, 3-4, those areas really haven't changed. The themes had to do with consumer safety protocols, which is defined as someone who could harm themselves, harm others. Maybe there's medical emergencies, or one aspect that has changed a little bit about that is making sure that you are addressing fraudulent medications and how you would report that to your consumers and how the consumers can report that to you, what that medication that is fraudulent is. In any way, you have to have a policy and procedure for your staff to be able to go to address a distress caller calling in and to address some of these other themes, and really to explain how you are going to have a protocol. All staff should be trained in these standards. And then the other standard in this section had to do with employment screening. Absolutely no changes there. So if you have staff who are handling any information that has PHI information on it, they have to have criminal background checks upon hire. So again, prior to the start date. And if they are handling any pharmaceuticals, they have to have a drug screening, again, prior to the start date. Okay. We'll move
And
on.
Leslie, before
Yeah.
I move on, we have two questions.
Okay.
One is, does the pharmacy determine the jurisdiction, or is it required by every state that we are serving? And this is for the senior clinical staff person.
So that will actually be determined by, first of all, regulations. So when you do business in several states, some of the states are requiring your organization to have somebody licensed in that area. Many organizations are going to pick that it is their most senior person. As long as you have at least one person and they're the people who are dispensing the drug for that state, it could be that individual. So it's kind of a two-part answer. It can be left up to you, but you have to make sure you're following what your regulations require. And what's the second question?
And the second question is, will the audience be able to get a copy of these slides? And the answer to that is yes.
Great. Okay, so moving on to CPE 3-5, which is our financial incentives. This used to be a standard that would say, do you get a bonus? And if you have a bonus, are the incentives based on a consumer's utilization of care? Utilization of care that, and then we wanted to make sure that it wasn't, so that it didn't negatively affect their health. So we used to have a policy and procedure and an attestation that would state, if we provide bonuses, they won't be based on incentives that could potentially harm the consumer by utilization of your services. And so now what they have added as element B is an element to you to monitor the use of incentives to ensure that the consumer's healthcare is not compromised. So that's a little bit different. You're not just having a statement saying we don't provide bonuses, or we don't provide bonuses that would be incentivized by consumers' utilization of care that could negatively affect their health. This added aspect has to do with making sure that your policies address the monitoring of these incentives. Okay, so I'm going to move into my third focus today, which is the open standards, and I'm really going to address the staff management standards, starting with, can you go back one slide, please, Sue?
Mm-hmm.
Starting with our staff training standards. They have changed the language in some of these. They have added really a code of ethics and a code of conduct that Tom is going to address in his section. But let's go through these standards a little bit. Element A, privacy and security of information protection. So that's the same thing, making sure that we have training, not just a confidentiality statement, in confidentiality in HIPAA that addresses this element. Element B is making sure that you have training for new hires at the corporate level for initial orientation, and then at the department level for their initial orientation. So they have to have department level and corporate. That really hasn't changed, but it is one standard that seems to always be hard for our folks to meet. Then there will be training in ethics and healthcare, and then training in code of ethics. So one is ethics in healthcare that, again, Tom is going to address, and the other would be your code of ethics, which is really your code of conduct, your business conduct, making sure that you have annual training in conflict of interest, about false claims, fraud and abuse, and so forth, okay? You have to be able to meet, it says no wait, no wait, no wait, under elements 1D, sub-element 1, 2, 3, 4. But in order to meet element D, all of those have to be met in your training. So you must demonstrate training in all of these themes in order to meet element D. Core 3, the old Core 3 used to have a standard, and Core 28A that said that all staff have access to the most current policies and procedures. And now that is now enveloped in this element E, which says that staff have to have training in policies, process, and procedures, as well as the most current URAC standards related to their job duties. So they've somewhat taken standards that were split into two and enveloped them into one. You'll still want to be able to show that staff have access and were trained on policies and procedures for their department, and were trained in URAC standards applicable to their own duties. And then ongoing training to maintain competency in their own roles. That hasn't changed. Moving on to our next slide, PCR 3-4, staff member performance reviews. Now, they only have to be performed periodically as defined by you. They used to be annual, and URAC used to define that by not just your look back period, but when you signed off on it. That's not going to change in how they monitor how you're defining periodically. You must choose a numeric number. You can't just write in your policy they'll be performed periodically. But we do at IHS encourage your organization to choose something attainable. So if you want to write that they're done quarterly, if they're done every 18 months, make an attainable goal, because URAC will then go in to see what your look back period was and when they were signed off on and completed to make sure you're meeting your policy on this. Element B has also changed based on established expectations. This makes things so much easier than our old standards, which was you had to have some kind of documentation as part of your evaluation. This means you can take your job description and make sure that you are meeting those expectations in your job descriptions and make that as part of your evaluation. maybe the evaluation is a discussion of expectations that were spoken about the year before. So it is a much more, I think, obtainable goal and a more pragmatic approach to our evaluations. We used to really try and figure out how can we find in our evaluations the way URAC wants us to do this standard. And I feel like now URAC has seen how most of the evaluations are being completed, and this really does meet the goal. So if there aren't any questions about my part, and I know we're going to be taking questions later as well, I'm going to pass this back to you, Sue.
Great, great. Tom is going to start speaking about the consumer protection and empowerment.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Leslie, for that terrific summary of those standards. Very glad to see that performance evaluation area cleaned up. That's been a mess for our clients for as long as that's been a standard. So this first focus area that I'm going to talk about is consumer protection and empowerment. And there were a couple of standards, the privacy and security of consumer health information and information management, which is for you veterans, Farm Core 16 and Farm Core 14. They are essentially identical, so I won't be covering them today. What I'll dive into is the brand new standard. What you're seeing here on the slide is utterly new. There's no correlate in the existing or the previous version of the standards. So ethical healthcare practices in CPE 2-2 and 2-3. 2-2 establishes the practices that you need to include in your ethics, and 2-3 requires that you monitor and oversee the clinical healthcare practices. So what do we mean by ethical healthcare practices? Well, they have to include an affirmative obligation to report impaired, incompetent, or unethical practice, utterly new standard. The second element, avoidance of discrimination. Again, a new standard for the pharmacies. Professionalism in the use of digital media, no phishing and the other kinds of terrible things one can do with digital media. Conflict of interest has been mentioned in other standards, but it hasn't been wrapped up into this big healthcare practices basket. And then we skip down to F, which is, now this is an interesting one. The remaining four here are leading indicators. And as Leslie said, a leading indicator has no point value. You can choose to meet or not meet it. It will have no impact on your accreditation process. Simply a research mechanism for URAC looking to the future. But ethical obligations of medical and clinical directors might include something like under what situations might a senior clinician need to intervene in something. And then responsibility to study and prevent error. And then we've got prudent stewardship of healthcare resources. Basically, that you're going to be able to submit your quality management committee meeting minutes that look at how to allocate resources, and that will probably suffice for this element. And then finally, commitment to reduction in health disparities. Health disparities are both population-specific illness disparities. This population has these health issues that this population does not, or it might even be access. This population has access issues that this population does not. And so down the road, well, currently as a 0-point value element, or down the road, perhaps 3 or 4 years from now, we'll see this as a weighted standard. So something to start thinking about early. CPE 2-3 basically says you've got to monitor, you've got to identify somebody who's in charge of this area. You've got to commit to taking action when violations of these ethical standards arise. You need to collect information to help you monitor compliance. And then if you do have compliance issues, ethical compliance issues, then you need to kind of figure out, well, why is this going on? And how can we prevent this for the future? and what kind of trends are we seeing? Now that last element, as you see, is also a leading indicator. The others, though, have points associated with them. So those are the new areas in consumer protection and empowerment. We're going to move to risk management, or the RM standards. The regulatory compliance standard 1-1 is basically the old Core 4. So we'll move to the one that is a difference. This is the whistleblower standard. This is brand new. It has 3 essential components, all of which are important. One is mandatory, and the other 2 elements are worth 4 points. First of all, there is a protection of the whistleblower against retaliation, so long as their reporting is in good faith. Kind of standard whistleblower approach. The second is interesting. It imposes an obligation on your on you, the organization, to put into your policy an obligation of your employees to report violations. And then finally, the confidentiality. Your policy needs to describe how you're going to address the confidentiality of information in the whistleblower situation. So that's an entirely brand new thing, no correlate in the previous version of the standards. We're going to, let me see here. I think I'm going to go straight into RM 3.1. Oh yeah, so we're going to move into the world of, I'm going to skip over RM 2-1, 2-2, and 2-3. Those are the business continuity plan. That's the old Core 14. No major change there that you need to pay attention to. Obviously, it's important. You need to pay attention to it, but no major thing to address there. Pharmacy emergency management plan. It's now a separate standard, but it's really it was a part of the old business continuity plan, Pharm Core 14. And then business continuity plan testing was also part of Pharm Core 14. So those 3 taken together really look very much like Pharm Core 14. Nothing major to worry about there. On the other hand, the risk assessment standard, what used to be Pharm Core 15, is now RM 3-1. And as you can see here, URAC has gotten a good deal more specific about what it expects in terms of your risk management process. So let's take a quick look at this. And obviously, you could do a whole hour on this thing. Now, risk assessment, URAC wants to make sure that you are looking at risks across stored data, across your process for gathering data, and your process for transferring data. This information was mentioned in the accreditation guide in the previous version, but not this explicitly spelled out in the standard. And then element B, the risk assessment processes described in element A include a periodic risk assessment. Now, URAC doesn't describe the periodicity of your risk assessment. You get to do that, but don't just say periodic. Set a particular time. We're going to do this every 6 months. We're going to do this every year. So you set the time, and that's just a general thing. When URAC says periodic, it doesn't mean you can say periodic. It means you get to choose what the period is. But you can't just say, well, we're going to do this periodically. It's too general for URAC. Then the next element, risk prevention processes to identify, document, thwart, or remediate actual or potential hazards or threats to privacy. And those include access issues and breaches, including those that you decide are incidents, which including those, but not limited to those that you decide are breaches. So have a well-documented policy that lays out how are you going to identify, how are you going to document, how are you going to prevent and then fix actual or potential issues that you discover. And you might discover these either in the risk assessment that you do under element A, or just somebody discovers it. So it's not necessarily limited to those that you encounter during the RM 3-1A risk assessment process. And then you can see we've got a leading indicator and 3 2-point elements below that describe what is expected of your organization if you do have gaps or potential failures. You've got to have a root cause analysis. You've got to develop a cap. You've got to manage your cap, and then you have to have an ongoing, again, periodic, watch out for that word, ongoing and monitoring reevaluation to ensure that you're implementing your cap and sustaining compliance.
And Tom, we have a question related to risk assessment.
Excellent.
And what is URAC looking for in its policies, procedures, and training to staff?
This is, my answer will basically describe how all of your policies should be written. And that is, you've got to identify who's going to do it, what they have to do, and how they're going to do it. The issue that we see most frequently that's a problem with applicants' policies and procedures is that they speak at some general level. The organization will do X, Y, and Z, and they don't identify who's responsible, and they don't identify how it's going to get done. And if URAC says periodic, or how often they're going to do it, and if they're going to use any particular tools to do it. So you might, what we have recommended in the past for Core 15, and we'll recommend again for RM 3-1, for example, is to attach to your policy or submit separate from the policy a template of your risk assessment tool. If you do, our organization is certified by URAC, and so this standard applies to us. And so what we have is a risk assessment tool that's a spreadsheet that we use to assess our own, on an ongoing basis, our own risks, security risks. And so submitting a template tool to URAC is probably a good idea. And they'll probably almost certainly want to see during the validation review process, they'll almost certainly want to see an example of how you actually used that tool and filled out the boxes in it.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Right. Thank you, Sue. So this is, Leslie mentioned this earlier, and it's a new standard, OPIN 1-1, the Code of Ethical Business Conduct. So first of all, what URAC is stressing here is you got to write it down. You can't just say we comply with business ethics. You got to write it down and say, this is what we mean by business ethics. And that written document needs to be approved by senior management. And it needs to address these elements that you see outlined before. What are the agreed upon ethical principles? What behavior is expected? This might include, the whistleblower requirement. As you can see just below that in element B3. But what do we expect you to do, and what do we expect you not to do as an employee of this organization? Whistleblowers, and then what happens if you violate this code of ethics? This is all brand new, not just the whistleblower part. It's all an utterly new piece. Also in the OPIN 1 section, which is about business ethics generally, there is a standard for written business agreements. This is unchanged from Core 11 before, so you've got to have agreements with your clients. So finally, I'm going to finish my piece of this on OPIN 4-1, Delegation Management. For those of you who have gone through the previous version, you'll recall that it was Core 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then about 18 months ago, URAC collapsed all 4 of those into the new Core 9. This resembles that new Core 9 that was rolled out a little while ago. And it looks, you would think, well, if you're going to collapse 4 standards into 1, and that standard has only these 2 rather general elements, then maybe they're taking it a little easier on us. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Actually, this is a much more rigorous piece of oversight than was required before. You still need what used to be a Core 8 agreement. It doesn't have to have all of those 8 particular pieces of language in there, but some of them are suggested. So you're going to need to dive deeply into the accreditation guide, and if you're a client of ours, into our tips and tricks, in order to, or go to our website and go onto the tips page of our website and just plug this OPIN 4-1 and you'll see our take on this. This is going to involve a more rigorous approach. Basically what URAC says is you're still on the hook, and now when you delegate a function to somebody else, not only are you still on the hook, but you have to actually act like we would act, we being URAC. So if URAC would verify compliance with its standards for PM 6 through 10 in a certain way, you need to oversee your delegated contractor to which you have delegated those functions in a way that roughly resembles the way URAC would do that. So you basically have to learn how to become URAC reviewers at a certain level. I'm sure it's not strictly according to code, although we'll find out over time as these standards get interpreted over the next couple of years. But URAC does make clear in the accreditation guide that its expectations are that you're on the hook to ensure URAC compliance by your delegated contractor, and that you need to use methods that resemble what URAC would use to verify compliance in those standards. And with that, Sue, I'll toss it back to you.
Okay, great. Well, in my section, I'm going to be covering compliance with policies and procedures. I will also cover the quality standards, which have some changes, but not a great deal, as well as the reporting standards, which do not have any changes other than they compacted them together into one standard. For those of you who have been accredited, you may remember RPT1 and RPT2. Now there's just one measures reporting standard, and there's element A and element B. One is related to mandatory, and B, which is a leading indicator and is optional, are the exploratory standards. I'll move on to the policy and procedure one, maintaining and complying with policies and procedures. So in this standard, what URAC has changed is basically the time frame of when you have to review those policies and procedures. Remember before, it used to say on an annual basis, and URAC defined annual as month year to month year. Now the standard says at least every 36 months to the month, you have to review your policies and procedures. And if there are approved changes within that 36-month time period, you have to disseminate it, communicate it, and make it effective. Element B, which is another mandatory element, is the one that sometimes gets organizations into trouble, because you have to maintain and comply with your policies and processes that govern your core business operations related to the scope of the accreditation. So what does that mean? So URAC has this rule that says if you miss 3 unrelated weighted standards, not the mandatory standards, because remember, those are the gatekeeper standards. And if they were to include mandatory standards, if you were out of compliance with mandatory standards, it would almost be like double jeopardy, because if you miss one standard, you fall into a conditional. If you miss 2 mandatory standards, you fall into corrective action, and 3 mandatory standards missed, you're denied accreditation. So that's why they're limiting it only to the weighted standards, because the mandatory standards basically take care of themselves. But you can see element B is mandatory. So we have to make sure that if you want to pay close attention to standards that you're choosing not to meet because they don't resonate with the way you do business. Because URAC will, if they're unrelated to each other, 3 unrelated weighted standards, they will cite element B as being out of compliance, and that is a mandatory standard. That hasn't changed, but it's an important concept that I felt that I needed to review with you again. Staff continue to have need to have access to a master list of all your policies and processes. And they've changed in element D. You may remember that there it used to say review date, revision date, effective dates, and the identification of the approval authority. Now they're limiting it to review date, effective date, and the identification of the approval authority. And then to go back to the quality piece, basically that whole section is called performance measurement indicators, or performance management indicators. And they include things like your quality management program scope. And in that standard, it's just repackaging. There are really no new requirements. You still have to define your scope. It requires that the functions covered under the scope of the accreditation are included, and you have to have measurable goals and interventions. Then PMI 1.2 talks about the structure and oversight. So there it speaks to either the quality management or the oversight committee performing oversight and guidance of that quality management program. You still have to monitor progress to meeting your goals. You have to have content experts appropriate to the program under accreditation. This is slightly different from the previous version. Before, the previous version said things like you had to have a practicing provider on your committee, but that was limited to standard sets that included a network of providers like health plan, health network. So now they've expanded it a little to say you need to have the right people on this committee, and it has to be appropriate to the program under accreditation. For instance, and under specialty pharmacy, sometimes organizations will have, they work with specific types of clinics, let's say, for instance, and they have input with the clinics on what, who they're going to be managing, what those drugs are, how it's going to be managed. You might want to consider having one of those content experts on the committee. You have to provide, this committee has to provide guidance on quality management priorities. Again, no change there. You have to approve your quality activities, and you have to periodically evaluate the effectiveness of the QM program. Remember what Tom told you. Anytime you see the word periodic, you have to define what that means to you. But it's a little tricky because in a later standard, it says you have to report the evaluation of your program to your leadership annually. So even though it says periodically evaluates the effectiveness of your program, you have to do it annually in order to be able to report it to your committee. So I'm going to tell you that periodic in this standard, I would recommend that you do it annually so you can comply with later standards.
Sue, I want to interrupt for a second.
Sure.
Before we move on, there were a couple of questions about the OPIN 2-2B.
Oh, sure.
The first one was to comply with your policies and procedures. Is there a best practice to ensure compliance?
Well, and it's how you monitor for compliance. So are you doing monitoring by doing audits, by looking at your complaint data, your satisfaction data, to see if there's anything there that would indicate that there was some non-compliance of staff? Is there direct observation by supervisors of how staff are complying with the policies and procedures? Your compliance department may be doing auditing and have programs, trainings in place, like for instance, on the business and healthcare ethics. So, and regulatory compliance. Those are all examples of how you can monitor for compliance with your policies and procedures.
Great,
and
thanks.
then,
go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, Tom.
The second question was for OPIN 2-2, what kind of documentation is required to submit for the desktop review?
For 2.2B.
Yeah, that's maintains and complies.
Same thing. Okay, so you have to have a statement in your policy that says that you will maintain and comply with those policies and processes that govern your pharmacy business. And then there is I would add a section on monitoring that says how you're going to monitor. You're going to do it through direct observation. You're going to do it through training. You're going to do it through auditing.
Thanks, Sue. That's all the questions we've got so far.
Okay, great. All right, then to go back to the quality piece, PMI 1-3 is the Quality Management Program implementation. This is where your committee has to select your indicators. You have to have defined performance metrics. And I will tell you that the best way to track your performance metrics is through some type of dashboard. And IHS does provide templates for you on dashboards by module, taking into consideration all the mandatory requirements that are in what we used to call the core standards and what are now incorporated into your standards, like access, consumer satisfaction, prescriber satisfaction, delegation oversight. That might be part of that dashboard. Those might be your metrics. And then in like specialty and mail, there are specific requirements that you have to address, like functional outcomes, clinical outcomes, things like that. And then you have to have defined monitoring as part of that. That's something that I would incorporate into that dashboard. There's an area for you to define how frequently you're going to monitor it and how frequently you're going to report it. Again, part of the dashboard. You have to measure, analyze, implement interventions for the following: errors and adverse events, near misses. Near misses is an area that is a particular problem for many organizations because they struggle with how to track near misses. But before, URAC, was nudging organizations because they asked it in all the interview questions. Now it's a clear, reportable item. You have to track near misses. Satisfaction, as I mentioned, both consumer and prescriber. Complaint access and outcome trends using valid and accurate measurement methods. So then that means that you're going to have to define what those measurement methods are. So there's some additional specificity required in this standard. And then you have to evaluate the effectiveness of your interventions and revise them as necessary. And you have to have periodic remeasurement of your indicators as long as necessary, but you get to define when that's going to occur. Is it for 3 quarters? Is it for 2 quarters? So you need to define how frequently you're going to monitor to ensure that you are able to sustain that your goal level of performance. And then PMI 1-4 speaks to data management and performance reporting. You have to have performance. Your program, the data management process has to support performance indicator collection, analysis, and reporting. And that includes both internal and external reporting. So if you have regulator reporting to the FDA, reporting to the boards of pharmacy, reporting to Medicare, reporting breaches, that all has to be included in your policy and procedure. So you need to define both internal and external reporting requirements. The data management needs to include the selection of the indicators. What are the quantifiable metrics? What are your goals? You have to be benchmarking your performance, and you have to ensure data integrity before you incorporate any of the results of the data into your processes. So that's all part of PMI 1.4. And then finally, PMI 1.5 is your program effectiveness. So that evaluation report to leadership must occur on an annual basis. And that report, or the program evaluation, needs to include recommendations from the committee on how you want to improve your program's effectiveness. You have to have the analysis of your performance against your goals. You have to identify whether the resources that you have available to monitor those goals are adequate and appropriate, or the right people involved, And the assessment, you have to do like a summary paragraph or section on whether of the impact of your program. So, and IHS does have a template for you for your annual evaluation that URAC has seen and has accepted. So we're happy to share that with our clients. So as I indicated, we've talked about the policies and procedures. We've talked about the changes to the PM program, and not the PM program, the quality program. They've taken 8 standards and reduced them to 5. As I indicated, there are a lot of the elements are the same, but some of the changes, while not many, may cause some organizations heartburn that are not used to having a lot of description about the analysis, the methodology in place. And then, as I indicated, the reporting standards are the same. Now, we're going to open up a question and answer area for you guys, and there will be some poll questions occurring like every few minutes. There'll be another poll question, so pay attention to that. There's information we'd like to get from you to help better inform our program.
Also on this last slide that is up here, element A, as you said, there's that change of at least every 36 months is when the policy procedures have to be reviewed. And as you stated, it used to be year to year, annual. My question that we have been talking about internally is, if I'm reaccreditation and I'm not due for reaccreditation in 2 years from now, can I start this every 36 months now? And the answer to that is that you are having to maintain your version of standards until it is time for you to submit the new version. So if you're on an older version, you're still under the requirement of having these annual policy and procedure reviews. And the reason is because you're going to be having monitoring on sites that could come up on in between these accreditation cycles of every 3 years, which used to be completed in a lottery, right? If URAC would run a lottery every year, and if you were chosen, you got the monitoring on site, but now it's a requirement. And so you can expect in your mid-cycle to get a call from URAC, and they'll let you know that they're going to come on board in the next little while. They don't give you that much notice for your monitoring on site. You need to make sure that you are meeting your old version of policy requirements. And this is a mandatory standard. So they review mandatory standards when you're on site. You can switch over to the new set of standards when you contract with URAC for the new set of standards.
And we do have a couple questions. The first is, are there slides related to the quality standards? We can add them when we send out the package so that you can have it in your PowerPoint presentation. And the second is, do we have any idea when changes to the PBM standards are going to occur? I do not have the schedule of when all of the changes will be made, but I will tell you there is a big push to get pharma all into this version. They've added additional resources at URAC to help that happen. So I don't expect it to, I don't know, is it in the next 6 months? I don't know that, but I would expect it in probably within the next 18 months.
If you were a gambling person and you were looking for an over-under, you'd probably go over on a year, but under on 18 months.
Yep.
Any other questions that you all have for us? I don't see any more questions rolling in. We are, there are some things that we didn't have time to put into this presentation that we're going to cover in future presentations. And one is the impact of COVID-19 on the accreditation process. Things like URAC at least suspending the on-site portion of the validation reviews and moving those to virtual and things like that. we are cooking up a COVID special webinar that we will be announcing to you shortly, as soon as we nail down a date. It's going to be within the next handful of weeks. So keep your eye open for that, because URAC and the other accreditation organizations, ACHC and others, are making some changes, at least for the period of time that so many of us in the healthcare world are affected, particularly you folks in the worlds that you're in. What is it? What's the impact of the strains on your staff, or do you have to suspend compliance with certain standards just to do your job in this time of healthcare crisis? So we'll be addressing that. And then we'll also, in a future webinar, we'll also be discussing that situation that Leslie touched on, and that is you're already under, let's say, 3.2, and then you haven't hit the submit button on your document, so you're not yet under 4.0. What is your review going to look like? And we'll talk about that in a future webinar. If you want to get a hold of us and ask questions, we'll be sending you a link so that you can schedule a call and be happy to talk with you. These are interesting times. They were interesting without this this pandemic, given that we have brand new standards that are still being interpreted by URAC, and ACHC is rolling out new standards this year. So it's a very interesting time to be in the pharmacy world. And interesting is also becoming not such a great word in terms of the strains on all of us. So we'll leave this open for another couple of minutes to allow for any more questions. We will be sending a survey out afterwards to ask you how you like this and how we can improve this webinar. So we will hope you give us some feedback on that. We're always trying to get better, and you're the people for whom we want to make this better. So we would ask you to answer these survey questions and these poll questions, and answer the surveys that we'll send you right after we're done here. So if you didn't get to ask your questions, please take advantage of the scheduling links to talk to, or send us an email. That will give you contact information of all sorts.
And if you scroll to the bottom and put your cursor at the bottom of your screen, that's where you'll find the polling questions, if you wouldn't mind doing that. That's where the Q&As are as well, and chat.
Well, again,
Well,
thank you all so very much
yes.
for your time and attention, and I'll turn it to Sue to close.
All right, as Tom indicated, we're very happy to work with all of you and to present this information today. You have our links. Feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Be well, be safe.
And your polls and satisfaction will be coming soon. It's at the end. Thank you.